So next up, we've got Greg Thorpe from C5, so Electricity Markets and Regulations.
Okay, thank you, Angela. Hello all. As you've heard, my name is Greg Thorpe. I'm currently convening the Australian C5 panel. Excuse me. As we will all be aware, there are major changes which are affecting everywhere in the industry, and markets and regulatory arrangements are no exception. So really, from a markets and regulation perspective, the previous paradigms simply are no longer fit for purpose. And that's a quote from one of the previous head of the Energy Security Board. So the job of C5 is to focus on the regulatory and commercial instruments. And if I can just comment that previous submissions have talked about how they either generate and transport and either up in the air or underground or whatever. Well, basically, if you want to get paid, now's the time to listen. I've used that joke before for other people who have been here. So the thing that comes out is that there are some common themes across quite a number of markets. So I'm not going to bore you with pictures of rule books and codes and clauses, which is what the output of the work of market design and regulatory design is all about. But what I think is useful is to do a quick review of the different markets and regulatory arrangements that the members of the C5 panel are involved in. And it's very instructive for me to prepare this. I did something similar the last time we had a presentation like this, and the degree of change is just out of this world. So, before I do that, just very briefly, we've got 18 members and we represent each Australian state, New Zealand and most recently Singapore joined. We've had meetings which are listed there, and the key matters raised in those meetings were the special reporter questions for Paris, our interventions, and our contributions to the large disturbance workshop, which Greg Hesse has also mentioned because that is a joint undertaking with C2. Just a quick comment on that, which is the only one I'm going to make on the large disturbance workshop, is one of the conclusions that I reached from that disturbance workshop was that what came across to me was that previously in the large disturbance workshops, because everyone loves a good disaster story, but the big thing is what lessons can you learn from it? Now, in the more recent past, the messages that you had to learn was that you had to be prepared for essentially low inertia power systems. And that was something that people had to get their heads around a few years ago. And what are the techniques? The comment that I made in that workshop was that I think that is now standard practice. Everyone is doing that. That is a well understood fact. But what came over to me in the presentations from the workshop, and I won't go through them again because Greg has touched on most of them, is that it's the resilience to unexpected events that go outside the pure engineering side. And that is if you get the cyclonic conditions, the wildfire conditions, and how the various interacting bodies respond. I'll just pick out one, and that was the case that we had from Western Australia. It was for a cyclone. Western Australia gets plenty of cyclones up north, but they got cyclonic winds down south. And the system, the transmission network down south, was not designed for those sorts of conditions, whereas it is to the north. So it means that although they did all the right things to build their network, etc., the changes that we are now seeing increase the potential for external factors. Another one was in the wildfire between Spain and France that Greg also mentioned, and one of the contributing factors to the size of that was a tardiness in the fire authorities to be coordinating with the power system operators. So the power system operators were not ready, or not as ready for what was coming because of a wildfire. And that is a communication issue between those authorities. And there were a number of others. And you can listen to the replay on the Seagrey website. But the point is that it is preparation for things which are not just straightforward engineering matters. It is the broader spectrum. Okay, what I said I would do now is to just touch on the major developments across the different markets that the members of C5 panel are involved in. And as I said, I'm doing this because I think you can see that we get a lot of experience from all of those changes, and these are the sorts of things that drive the activities of C5 in Australia, and they're not unusual across the world. New Zealand, they've changed their pricing for their spot market. It is now a real-time pricing market. Looks very similar to what the NEM used to look like, I must say. But that was a major change for the New Zealand market, commenced at the start of November. There's been a major change in transmission pricing. They're also looking, unsurprisingly, about things like a 100% renewable system, and they're talking about using one of the major lakes for battery, a hydro battery. The Darwin-Katherine interconnected system, I reported last year that everything was gung-ho there. For essentially political reasons, things have slowed down, but there is still a strong emphasis on renewable mandate and still looking to use open access and competition. Interestingly there, from a regulatory point of view, what they're trying to do there is to adopt parts of the NEM, the NER. I don't mean the word for word, but I mean the structure and the mechanisms that are there if they are fit for purpose. And as that note says there, the economic regulation of the network in the 3 regulated systems in the Northern Territory is already under the AER. Northwest interconnected system in the Pilbara. I reported last time they had just made some major changes there, doing things like implementing an independent system operator between what is essentially privately owned groups who are now linked together. That is being bedded down, and there are some discussions around decarbonisation. The Swiss in Western Australia, so in the south, there is for the first time their capacity mechanism. A lot of interest in capacity mechanisms in the last year or two in Australia, of course, and WA has had one for a long time. But for the first time, they did not get enough response from the first round of seeking capacity for 3 years' time. So they are now moving to the second stage to chase capacity, which is called the Supplementary Reserve Capacity Auction. So it's very interesting for the first time that they have not had sufficient response. So it'll be interesting to watch how that operates. In parallel, they're also doing a major review of that whole mechanism. I've also reported last time there'd been a completion of major reform design that's being bedded down, and some work on hydrogen renewable initiatives, and a novel energy savings campaign which has dramatically increased information to customers. The Australian NEM, yes, well, tumultuous year, as we all know. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this. We all know prices have been very high for both gas and electricity, flowing through to us at home, and there is the government is when the press are full of, well, what sort of intervention? It's hardly a case of if now, it'd be my reading of it, but when and how. And of course we have the well-known suspension of the NEM. Before I go on to the work of C5, I did leave a slide out. I thought I'd prepared it. I must have sent an earlier version. I said we had a new member from Singapore. I'm glad he's not here because I left out the summary of the Singapore market. Another interesting development there, the Singapore market, for those who may know, has a lot of similarities to, say, the spot market like Australia, and it has hedge contracts, except that there is still a strong degree of regulation over those prices. What the government has made announcements, in particular about long-term development, about how to reduce emissions, because it's a heavily gas-fired system. Then if you look afield from Singapore up through Malaysia, Thailand and into Laos, there's a lot of hydro. So there's going to be a lot of effort to utilise the connections, which most of them are actually in place, but a lot of the institutional arrangements are not there. So the Singapore government now has a very strong interest in being able to see major changes to the ability to be able to end up with bigger imports from the north, in their case, down into Singapore as a substitute for gas. So that'll be one to watch from the Singapore point of view. Okay, turning to the work of our panel in Australia, and what I've said here on the beginning of that is, of this point, is that the members of the panel come from those half a dozen different market designs. They've all got different perspectives, but they've all got a common theme, and there's a lot of overlap. And just like when you go off and meet people in Paris, or a working group or a symposium, etc., everyone's got something to contribute, which is fantastic. One little divergence is that a guy from the US, they always know how to do things, of course, but he has told me that the value he gets from from Seagrey is to come along here and realise, hey, there is a different way to do things than we do it. So I was really chuffed on behalf of Seagrey to hear that. I've mentioned the large disturbance workshop, where we had a lot of people present. I've mentioned the resilience question that is much broader than the technical issues that we used to deal with. And the other work of the C5 panel in Australia was to prepare quite a number of interventions for the technical session. So the other work of the C5 panel, as far as working groups are concerned, probably one of our most active members, excuse me, is David Bowker, who's been heavily involved in issues around blockchain and interactions and joint working with IEEE. So the tutorials and the draft TB has been completed. And there's a list which I won't go through in each of them, but if you read the list there, you can see the similarities with a lot of the things that the Australian panel has been doing. These are the working groups that are operating internationally, and why the Australian panel, or members of the Australian panel, have got something to be able to contribute to each of these working groups. And that's it.